Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who've been at our events before, welcome back. For anyone who's joining new for the first time today, welcome. The aim of this series is to think creatively about how we can build back better in the face of the pandemic, and with the huge amounts of federal money going into supporting the economy, how can we get a better outcome out of that for the longer term? So today we're going to be talking about industry and greening industry. We have a fantastic group of people with us today. As usual, we'll hear people's suggestions, we'll have a conversation. We've got slightly fewer panelists today, so we're hoping to get have a slightly longer period where we can answer your questions and get your input. That is a very important reason why we're doing this event. So we would encourage you to both ask questions in the Zoom panel, and we will answer some of those online, and we're certainly collecting them. But we'll also encourage you to send in any thoughts afterwards so that we can develop a proposal together and really put all our minds to work on this really important topic. So with that, I'm going to pass over today to Toby, whom you all know, who will introduce today's proceedings.
Thanks, Diana, and thanks everybody for making time to join today. I just have three brief points. The first one is, last week we saw more gathering momentum for green recovery globally, with leaders from the economics profession, labor, and business community across the world in our G7 peer countries coming out strong in support of a green recovery, including 80 business leaders from France who signed on to a letter calling for the green recovery to be at the center of the economic recovery package. So that's one thing. In Canada, just yesterday, the federal government linked one of its core central programs as part of the dealing with the pandemic to providing relief to large employers to climate disclosure. So seeing the climate lens be inserted in the central government program occurs well, I think, for the thinking that's going on right now in Ottawa. I think that hasn't been enough to stop some of the more erstwhile commentators, gadflies, in the likes of the National Post, is one publication from, calling out the notion of a green recovery is dangerous mission creep. I think nothing could be further from the truth. When you look at the numbers and let sober analysis be your guide, it's clear that a green recovery isn't mission creep, it's mission critical. It's mission critical because it's the source of where we're going to find a lot of our near-term jobs, and it's also the source of where we're going to have the best prospect for growth markets, and a more resilient economy. What we're going to speak about today on the industry side is more related to the recovery period. There's a little bit of stimulus potentially in the electrification of light industry, which is a big opportunity, something that's already gathering steam, and we could accelerate and could be part of a stimulus potentially. And as well, there's the longer-term play of decarbonizing heavy industry, specifically looking at industries that are responsible for vast, huge amounts of carbon, like steel and cement. And there's an interesting policy mechanism where if you pay those folks with a long lead price, for example, $100 per ton of reduced emissions, you can really incent some scale investments to get not rapid, but dramatic carbon reduction over time. And then the last one is boosting the circular economy, looking specifically at how do we fix Canada's broken recycling industry, by looking at what the federal government can do, not just with bans of certain types of substances and minimum recycled content, which is under the purview of the federal government, but also using the pedestal of the federal government and the financial resources of the federal government to create carrots to help to bring and harmonize provinces alongside extended producer responsibility, covering 100% of the cost above what is economic for the recyclers, and is a reward for provinces that want to play ball on that, providing the, businesses in those provinces with tax credits to make investments to scale up and consolidate the recycling industry, which is a growth market for us and is an essential part of the circular economy. So with that, I'll pass it back to Diana, and thanks everyone for joining today.
Fantastic, Terri. Thank you so much. I think what's interesting about this space is that there's obviously been a renewed emphasis on domestic capacity for producing things during the pandemic, whether it's producing ventilators or producing personal protective equipment, etc. And many people for a long time have felt uncomfortable about the hollowing out of manufacturing and the move to the service economy in the advanced countries. I think now they are looking even more skeptically at what has happened. I think Canada is well placed to move forward in this area. Manufacturing accounts for 10% of GDP, and that's not including things like construction and the oil and gas industry. That's pure heavy and light manufacturing. It's reasonably small, but it has some very advanced companies working here. So let me pass over now Ralph Torrie, who is our resident analyzer of what might happen, and he will share these ideas for how we might move forward to create a greener and thriving industrial sector in Canada. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, Diana. Good day, everybody. This has really been there's been quite a few people who have been putting their heads together on this. So I just want to make that clear that it's been a collective effort as we have been thinking through these different areas of focus of the Corporate Knights Green Recovery webinars over the last few weeks. This focus on manufacturing this week is particularly interesting, but also particularly challenging. It's interesting, as Diana mentioned, to see the extent to which industry can quickly pivot when there's an urgent need or a high motivation. We've seen a number of Canadian industries redeploy and refocus their know-how and their production technologies to make the things and provide the services that we need right now to respond to this pandemic. It's somewhat reminiscent of how quickly the Canadian auto industry pivoted to production during World War II. And we tend to forget that in a business as usual environment, just how capable we are of changing when we need to and innovating in response to motivation. And that's important, I think, because things have been put on pause here a little bit, and we're all thinking about how can we have the clean production systems that we know we have to move toward if we're going to have a healthier and more sustainable society. Diana's mentioned some of the numbers about our manufacturing sector in Canada, the heavy industry in particular. Sometimes we call them the smokestack industry: steel, cement, paper, industrial chemicals. They totally dominate the energy use and the greenhouse gas emissions from manufacturing in this country. They, you know, these are the industries that take things like trees and rocks and gravel and turn them into useful materials for other manufacturers to work with. And so they very often are using technologies and processes that are very energy intensive, very often involving high temperatures and furnaces and kilns. They're important industries in this country. The contribution they make to GDP belies how significant they are as cotter pins in our industrial and productive culture. They are the mainstays of employment and economic activity in the communities where they're located, and their multiplier and spin-off effects ripple out throughout the economy and throughout the country. So we need to think hard about how they will make this transition to clean production, because it is a game changer for them, maybe in a way that it's not for other sectors of the economy, because it does go directly to their production technologies and processes. The transition to sustainable production also proceeds on many, many fronts. Dematerialization, things are getting lighter. The services as substitutes for commodities is becoming a very important trend. We talked about that in the mobility panel. The need to eliminate toxic byproducts and waste, to accelerate recycling, all of these different elements of the move towards a clean production system are operating on many different fronts. And ultimately what we're trying to get to is a production system which emulates the elegance and the circularity of natural systems. What we're going to focus on today, as Toby has already indicated, are three different elements in this transition. One are these heavy industries themselves. We've grown accustomed to thinking about them, these big primary processors, as being necessarily energy and carbon intensive and maybe necessarily dirty. It's not true, and Chris Bataille will expand on this. There are a lot of options and a tremendous amount of innovation going on in that primary processing sector right now, which has and must continue to be so important in the Canadian economy. And one of our proposals is specifically targeting steel and cement and how we can accelerate the move towards zero carbon and low carbon production strategies in those two sectors. With respect to the circular economy and zero waste elements of a clean production system, here we think that government procurement, for example, not only in steel and cement, but in general, can be a powerful lever for increasing the circularity of our economy and reducing the waste that it generates. You know, the waste industries have been the fastest growing segment of the Canadian economy for the past 20 years. I don't know if that's something to be proud of or not, but it's quite phenomenal, growing 3 times faster than the rest of the economy. And this is going to be a permanent fixture in the circular economy, the industries that support the recycling of materials. And then finally, with respect to the general manufacturing industries, which are make a much larger contribution to manufacturing GDP than their energy and emissions might suggest, here again, it's important to continue the trends we already see there towards electrification and cleaner energy. And that forms the sort of third focus of where we are developing our proposals for the green recovery in the Canadian manufacturing sector. These are all important sources of employment and technological innovation and economic development. And in the post-COVID recovery period, it's going to be particularly important that we renew and green our manufacturing sector. And I'm looking forward to actually the inputs from the other panelists. So I'll stop now with those words of introduction.
Thank you so much, Ralph. That was a great introduction. I think it will be useful in the discussion to keep those 3 pieces slightly separate, but then we'll bring them all together in the document. Again, I'd like to reiterate that we have a Q&A panel open, so please do type any questions in there. First of all, I'm going now to delve deep into that heavy industry side. I think until recently, what have been called the hard to abate sectors, steel and cement, have really felt like something we can't do much about in terms of emissions. They both account for about 8% of global emissions, and use is increasing as urbanization increases. So I think what's really exciting now is that there are technologies and power sources on the table that can make both of those much more carbon efficient, possibly even carbon neutral. And in the case of cement, I'm told there is promise of carbon negative cement with carbon curing technology. Someone who knows a lot about that is Chris Bataille, who's an energy economist. He served as a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He works at IDRI, and he focuses specifically on the heavy industries. So I'd like to bring Chris in now to comment on what Ralph said and perhaps give us a few more details about how we can make progress in this area.
Sure, thank you very much, Diane. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. As some might be aware, both cement and steel are 2 of the most used materials and commodities in the world. Basic civilization as it is not possible without them. We can probably make do without fossil fuels in the long run, but it's going to be a while before we can do without cement, steel, if ever, at least at the technological level we're at. Now, as Diane was saying, these have been treated as hard to abate sectors for decades since we've been talking about climate change. Up until about 5 years ago, we were shooting at climate targets of -80%. And the assumption was that steel and cement would just carry on emitting, though they would always fit under that last 20%. But with the move to 1.5 to 2C, holding our temperatures to 1.5 to 2C, it means we have to go net zero somewhere between 2050 to 2070. And that means all sectors have to go to zero. Steel and cement are no longer exempt, and as are none of the heavy industries are. Now, the industrialization in these sectors is technically possible. We know of at least 6 ways to completely eliminate emissions in steel, and there's a whole series of things that we can do in cement. Some of them are actually quite easy and cheap, getting down to -30, -40%. And then we get into deeper, more transformative things, including carbon capture and storage for the process emissions, alternative fuels. But eventually, as Diane said, we need to change the chemistry that we're using to make cement, and that may allow us to into the deep negatives, possibly. But that's going to take probably 20, 30, 40 years in order to make that commercial. But in the meantime, we have to bring emissions down. Now, so we know how to do this, and anybody out there, you want a 15 to 45-minute presentation, I'll talk all about that in at some other time. But for the industries as they exist today, industrial decarbonization, one of the reasons that they were called hard to abate, we've made very little progress in the past, it's really risky. These sectors are very low profit margin, they're very competitive, stock turns over really slowly. A steel plant can last 50 to 75 years. These plants can literally last forever with retrofitting and repair. They're very capital intense. And the most fundamental problem with both of them is that there is no market for low GHG goods. We have one of the cleanest primary steel plants in Canada, in Quebec, and they don't get $1 extra for the steel they sell. There is absolutely no valuation of the varying GHG intensity of steel, cement, chemicals, what have you at this point in time, and that has to change. So one of the first things we have to do is we've got to start measuring. We have to start measuring the GHG intensity of these products. They vary wildly. They're widely, steel, cement, and chemicals across the board can vary wildly in terms of their intensity today. And we have to start valuing those variations. So we have to come up with internationally agreed methods for doing that. Everyone can put a stamp on their steel or cement, and away we go. Now, some R&D is needed, but really we know what the technologies are to really drive deep reductions in these sectors. The trick is we've got to get them out of engineers, back laboratories, and out of the small lab bench pilot stage up to a sort of small scale pilot and up to a commercial pilot. Now, this whole transition is what's called the valley of death in the innovation industry. It's extremely expensive, extremely risky, and companies only do it if they've got some hope of making money back in the long haul. So one of the things we have to do, and the reason we have very low cost wind and solar today, is that we created markets for those generation technologies. We had targeted niche market. First, solar PV first showed up on satellites, then on remote locations, and then sort of pocketed areas far away from the grid, and they were paid the value of their service there. So the trick is we have to create lead and niche markets for green steel and cement that values that contribution. So one of the things, this can be done both from a government point of view and a private sector point of view. Government can put a value on lower GHG steel and cement. It can put a dynamic falling premium on that. And effectively, it's an output subsidy. For steel, you probably have to put some, when you start, probably $100 to $200 a ton on top, and that's going to be prorated to the GHG intensity against a benchmark. And you get the full subsidy if you're zero, half if you're half of whatever the benchmark is. But those subsidies would not go on forever, and they could be calculated. We could budget them for them going forward through time, and they would fall off as the technology becomes commercial. It's not something that becomes an infinite sink out of our financial resources. But what it critically does is lowers risk for steel and cement companies as they make investments going forward. part of making that commitment is governments do have to commit to net zero industry. We have to commit to both demand and circularity policies, as Ralph was talking about. We need to get into a conversation with our steel and cement manufacturers. Right now, you told them that they have to invest billions in highly risky technology with possibly no return. They're going to say, no. We can't tell our shareholders that. You have to get into a conversation with them. Tell them, yes, we're going to help you with the R&D. We're going to help you. There will be markets for you when you've got this process done. But for all that help, come 2035, we're going to require that new technology becomes the baseline that we operate against. In the long haul, you can only do this sort of subsidization for so long. Eventually, internal GHG pricing has got to catch up. We've got to put a price on the GHG content of the materials we use. And if only some jurisdictions are applying that and not others, you're going to have to ring fence the bubble and put some sort of border protections on there. But that's not for today. That's probably 5, 10, 15 years down the road. The final problem is that there's a huge already built stock of steel and cement plants out there that are really high GHG intensity. They are partially retrofittable with advanced technologies, but some of them simply probably will have to be retired early, and that's going to have very large political economy and just transition issues attached to it. What do we do with the steel and cement plants that we have to shut down such that we can replace them with fully clean ones going forward? And that's a very complicated and serious question. So that's all I wanted to say right now, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'd like to call up now the first of our 2 polls. We always try and include not only questions but in polls. So if you could mount that poll, we'll get you voting. Well, there we go. It's all about cement and steel. So if you'd like to vote on that, that would be fantastic. I will come back to the results shortly. Now I'd like to turn, Chris talked about steel and cement. We have people who are experts in both sectors here. So first of all, I wanted to turn to Kent Stuehmer, who is Vice President of Cement Operations at Lehigh, Hanson, Canada. Can you tell us how this feels from your side and what you think you can contribute to a zero carbon cement sector in the medium term? Are you there?
First, thank you for the opportunity with some industry perspectives today. We're really pleased to see growing attention to the opportunities in our sector. As Chris mentioned, globally, after water usage, concrete is the most consumed material in the world, and cement is a fundamental component of concrete. Cement manufacturing accounts for about 5 to 7% of global CO2 emissions. As Chris noted in his article and just in his comments, there's a ton of opportunities to reduce emissions from cement, some of which are technologically and commercially viable today and can be accelerated with relative modest strategic investments done in parallel with smart regulatory policies. For example, expanded use of low carbon fuels or alternative fuels, as well as low carbon blended cements, could reduce the overall carbon intensity of cement by 30 to 40%, effective more or less immediately. Yes, there are some capital costs, to say in the orders of tens of millions per facility, and government programs in addition to carbon pricing can help defray these. In fact, short-term support for low carbon investment will be essential to keeping our sector competitive in the face of increasingly stringent climate policy. Our major obstacles are actually regulatory. For example, in just about every province in Canada, it's surprisingly difficult to get permits to burn non-traditional fuel or alternative fuels. It's hard to get governments who consume about 50% of all building materials to buy low carbon products, including low carbon cements. Our low carbon transition is going to hinge to a significant degree on government procurement, as has been mentioned. Success in these areas still leaves us far short of our goal of carbon neutrality. My parent company, Heidelberg Cement's vision is carbon neutral concrete by 2050, and to do this, we are investing heavily in carbon capture technologies. The economics of running a full-scale carbon capture system in Canada are improving with carbon pricing, but the capital investment required to build a large-scale CCUS system is in the order of $500 billion, and it remains out of reach without cost CCUS feasibility study is currently underway at our Edmonton, Alberta facility, where we are aiming to make Canada home to the first carbon neutral cement facility in North America and possibly the world if we move fast enough. You'll need hundreds of millions in support to become a reality, but we believe will be critical leap forward in making CCUS more accessible to other cement facilities in Canada, the world, and other high emitting sectors. Our Edmonton facility with CCUS, low carbon fuels, and low carbon blended cement produce a carbon negative cement. And I think this could be the first cement in our industry. The elephant in the room is what to do with the carbon once captured. Geologic storage is only one option in certain areas and is only available in certain areas outside of using enhanced oil recovery. Capture doesn't do anything, or storage doesn't do anything to improve the economic drivers for CCUS. Here again, cement and concrete will likely play a keystone role using capture carbon in concrete hardening or carbonization, looking at life cycles and bringing it back into our system to produce negative aggregates and use again in the production of cement. These are medium to long-term technologies that will take time to refine and scale. They will also face the same hurdles in terms of conservative codes, standards, and the need to reorient government procurement processes towards early adoption of low carbon solutions. There are many activities underway to utilize CO2, and we want to continue to expand the list of potential users. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kent. We have a number of questions coming in which are specifically about cement and about the aggregate and the processes around cement, which I think we probably won't be able to answer online now, but we will get to. And some of them concern regulation about what can be put in and other things like that. I think that you raised the issue of procurement, and particularly the fact that the government is the major customer for a lot of your product. Before we get to that, and we have just the right person to answer those questions, I wanted to switch and move over now to Mark Rowlinson, who's with the United Steelworkers and chair of Blue Green Canada, to talk a little bit about the steel industry. We have a question in which is about why we wouldn't do more in terms of domestic steel production, particularly given the emissions associated with transport of steel. So there's a clear advantage to making it at home, which I'm sure you'd agree with. Can you talk about what you think the prospects are for decarbonized steel and what you need to happen for that to take place?
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me just first say, I think we need to start by at least acknowledging that Canada has not been especially good at promoting the growth of manufacturing over the last number of decades. I think we have to acknowledge that. So Ralph mentioned at the outset that currently manufacturing is about 10% of GDP. That is down from 16% of GDP a mere 20 years ago in 2000. We've seen a similar loss in the number of jobs connected to manufacturing in Canada from about 16% of the total workforce, again, 20 years ago, to about 9% today. And that doesn't have to be that way. If you compare us to Germany, where in fact manufacturing percent of GDP rose by about 60% over the last over a similar time period. However, one of the things that people have become aware of as a result of the pandemic is that there are limitations to not having a domestic manufacturing facility. Diana mentioned at the outset that it has become apparent that, you know, how quickly we can spin manufacturing around to manufacture medical equipment. And we also, in Canada, observed to some extent an inability to have a sufficient domestic manufacturing capacity for manufacturing medical equipment. So that has at least brought the issue to light. And I do think that going forward, Canada is actually well placed to develop an advanced manufacturing sector, but it will only do so if we have a plan in both government and the private sector to actually do so. So let me talk a little bit about steel as an example. The Canadian steel industry is amongst the most low carbon steel industries in the world, as Chris mentioned. The Canadian Steel Producers Association has in fact recently committed to 2050. We have a couple of advantages. One is we have a relatively low carbon source electricity grid in most parts of the country. We also have a substantial component of the Canadian steel industry operates on the basis of electric arc furnaces. Just by way of background, there are basically two ways of making steel. One is by melting scrap using electric arc furnace. The other is by making basic steel by combining essentially iron ore and carbon in a blast furnace. And a lot of the Canadian steel industry electric arc furnaces. But going forward, we will need to make substantial investments in our steel industry if we're going to actually be able to decarbonize it. One technology that I know the steel industry globally is very interested in is replacing the carbon that currently is sourced from metallurgical coal with hydrogen. And there are already pilot projects in Germany and Sweden that are being built to actually technology. What concerns me is that I don't see similar investments being made in Canada. And I think that the Canadian government needs to actually look seriously at doing everything it can to invest, because while our steel industry is low carbon, it's also relatively old. We haven't had a new steel mill built in this country since the late 70s. And they can be retrofitted, and they have been retrofitted, but over time, be a concern. If you compare steel to, for example, aluminum, I won't talk a great deal about aluminum, but just to say on the aluminum front, we also have, by bar none, the lowest carbon aluminum industry in the world. Again, almost entirely due to low carbon electricity in Quebec and British Columbia. And you're already seeing in Quebec a Rio Tinto project to develop zero carbon aluminum being developed in Quebec. So again, on the aluminum front, we're actually ahead of where we are on the steel industry in terms of developing low carbon heavy industry. So lastly, I just want to talk about what are some of the barriers that we face in steel and in aluminum to developing a true low carbon economy of the future. The first barrier I just want to identify is that both steel and actually aluminum continue to be plagued by enormous overcapacity in the global market. And that global overcapacity largely comes from China, which is an extremely high carbon producer of both steel and aluminum. And as Chris mentioned, unless we figure out some way to price carbon emissions into the global price of steel and aluminum, it is going to continue to not be economic for large steel companies to make investments in a jurisdiction like Canada. The second barrier we face, and this has been raised before, but I think we need to talk seriously about our domestic stimulus and specifically government procurement. We do not do well when it comes to ensuring that Canadian government procurement, whether that's in bridges or transit, all of which use a lot of steel and aluminum, we need to make sure and do everything we can to ensure that those markets are created for domestic steel and aluminum using government procurement. And that may mean revisiting some of the provisions we have in current trade agreements and some of the provisions in the WTO General Agreement on Procurement. So those are just, we need to grow our domestic market, and we need to ensure that our domestic market is fairly protected from unfair trading practices as a result of global overcapacity. So I'll just end there quickly, and I look forward to discussions and questions.
Thank you so much. Just to report back on that poll, we had 73% in support, 12% disagreed, which actually is fairly consistent across some of the polls that we've been doing. And I think one of the questions that I see in the panel today is how do we build public support for the type of measures that are being proposed in this series? And that's always an issue. I mean, those who tune in are obviously generally reasonably well disposed. This is not a representative audience. But I think one of the issues that we'll get to perhaps in our final webinar in this series is how we take this further and how we can build up that support. As Toby mentioned, it's not universal even in the media right now. So we do have to think carefully about that. I'm going to turn now on the procurement side, as well as other things, to Nick Xenos, who's Executive Director at the Center for Greening Government at the Treasury Board. And he can talk about the role of government in as a purchaser and how government is thinking about greening its own operations.
Thank you. That's great. very good at it to date, and I'm listening with all ears and happy to follow up with some of my panel members afterwards. So the Government of Canada has something called the Greening Government Strategy. It's got targets in there to reduce our emissions, reduce our waste, and be resilient to a changing climate in our operations, so in our buildings, fleet, and procurement. And so we also have a policy on green procurement. Part of our work on the procurement side is looking at the environmental categories or criteria that we're caring about when we want to attack. And so lowering carbon emissions, obviously, how do we get to net zero basically in all of our government operations? So lowering carbon emissions, lowering waste, looking at circular economy, and how do you embed that into the different categories of things we buy. So the Government of Canada is the biggest public buyer in the country, and we buy stuff across the country from BC to Ontario, Quebec, Newfoundland to Nunavut to southern Canada. So, and we buy stuff for buildings, for infrastructure, for prisons, labs, bases, etc. So it's a really diversified portfolio. Obviously, we have worked, we want to continue working to green those categories of things we buy and look at developing what criteria we have in each of those things. And so one of the things that we need to do is look at, setting mandatory requirements in each of those areas. So we have already, we've said, okay, we want to reduce our carbon emissions from government's operations. And so we've already got mandatory requirements like new buildings built by the government should be zero carbon in terms of operational. And now we want to look at embody and see and attack that. Or in terms of our fleet, light duty fleet, 75% of vehicles have to be green, what we buy, and 100% of our electricity should be zero carbon electricity by 2022. And so then then we want to go into the next categories and look at, I think, the construction materials and buildings, for example, is the classic. We're big buyers. So how can we green procurement in the other categories? But bottom line, I think generally, not just for the Government of Canada, but for all governments, businesses, individuals, we just all have to ask for that, right? They all have to ask for greener goods and services. And that starts from the individual at home when you buy stuff to the organization like the Government of Canada. And then, then the next challenge is, okay, so how do I know what to buy, right? Who do I talk to, and how do I get the expertise I need to buy the greenest thing available? Well, that's where we've been working with industry and saying, okay, category by category, how do we buy? What's the greenest thing we can buy? Industry's already often saying, well, we can offer this. How come you're not buying this? How do we encourage that? So how do we find what's the best that industry can offer? And that's what we're going to do in the categories of big areas we want to buy. In other areas, governments or big buyers can pool together, right? Like, let's say, who are the 20 biggest buyers of cement in the country? Who are the 20 biggest buyers of steel in the country? Who are the 20 biggest buyers of fleet in the country, or who build buildings? So getting those guys together and saying then, okay, and matching with industry and saying, okay, well, we should all ask for this, right? And then we can collectively move the market much faster. Or those networks can at least learn from each other. So if somebody's got a higher bar, then how do we disseminate that higher bar quickly to everybody else, so that it's not a painfully slow process where one jurisdiction does something and then we wait 10 years for someone else to do something. And as mentioned on the panel today, I also really believe that this goes hand in hand with Canadian competitiveness, because I agree with the panel members. I think we probably provide the greenest stuff there is, or some of the greenest stuff there is. So this is hand in hand with increasing the domestic demand and the domestic market. The other ways we can look at greening procurement that we're looking at and others have looked at is, do you ask your suppliers for certain requirements? Or should our suppliers disclose their carbon, have a science-based target, etc., get extra points for that. So then, if we're buying something smaller like pens or something, we don't need to look at the carbon content of pens, but the supplier is heading to zero, so then that's good. We also, I think, we shouldn't underestimate sort of the data, knowledge, information gap we have in each of the categories of things we buy. A procurement process is relatively conservative in terms of government. So how do we make sure we address those data gaps and information gaps and connections to ensure the procurement folks have exactly the knowledge they need. So one example, we're working with, obviously in construction materials, it's a big gap, a big area where we as governments and businesses can ask for better. So we're working with the National Research Council to set up the low carbon assets for life cycle assessment. We're working with industry, cement, steel, et cetera, forestry, to build a Canadian database of carbon content in these construction materials, especially related to buildings, for example, to start. So that we know if we ask for a low embodied carbon building, that we can compare bids, we can compare on a fair platform what people are applying, and we can give points and credit it that way. So there are some data and information gaps there that we need to sort of roll up our sleeves, and we're happy to do that with our partners to get to the best requirements and how do we set those. And if we get the big buyers together, all asking for those, and we're accelerating that buy. So I'll leave it there. Happy to take comments and questions. And
thank you so much, Nick. It's great to know that you're working on a lot of those areas, and we've had a couple of comments in about regulations and how they affect the development of these industries, and obviously that's a government role. So thank you for being with us today. I'm going to turn now to Terri Lynn Morrison, who's been with us on a couple of these events before, and she is Director of Strategic Partnerships at Indigenous Clean Energy. We're not talking specifically about clean energy today, Terri Lynn, but what's your take on how this might affect the communities with which you deal?
Thank you, Diana. So I've been listening to a couple of the comments, and you know, just going back and reflecting on what Ralph mentioned at the beginning, that it's interesting to see how industry has changed and was able to adapt, you know, in light of the COVID situation, in terms of what services they're providing. And I think that this also shows that, you know, we are resilient, and that there's opportunity that lies in what's to come as we're moving forward in greening the economy. I think that, you know, as an Indigenous person, and you know, having done a lot of work in this field before, having one of the biggest cement plants in the province of Quebec in my home territory, there was opportunity there for innovation in terms of carbon capture, being able to use, you know, different ways to reduce the emissions and the environmental footprint that the companies are leaving, you know, when they're producing things in the heavy industry such as steel or concrete. I think that there's a role for industry to know what area they're operating in and who the Indigenous communities are, that, you know, if there's opportunities to partner to be able to reduce some of the output that's there, and that Indigenous communities are capable of being partners. I think that there's also a role of government. You know, when we talk about sorry, I lost the name of it, but the role of government, I would think through their programs that they offer, would be to support those partnerships that are zero carbon, that are sustainable partnerships. Sorry, I'm losing my words, but to actually, you know, enhance that relationship between Indigenous communities and industry, so that they can go ahead and support, you know, the reduction of the greenhouse gases and whatnot. And, you know, when we're talking about zero carbon buildings, you know, the behind the meter, being able to provide, having Indigenous communities be there to provide those services to the government or to industry, I think that those are really things that, you know, we need to start thinking a little bit outside the box, and that would help advance Indigenous position and Indigenous partnership in this field.
Thank you so much, Terri Lynn. I wanted to say, we're having a few connection issues this week. I don't know if other people are experiencing them, but we've had a few comments, and I apologize for that. It's not as clear as it has been in the past. I'd like to move on now to issues around circularity that Ralph started, that Ralph mentioned at the outset. And we have exactly the right person to talk about it, and that's Godard, who's Executive Director of the Recycling Council of Ontario. We don't do a good enough job in this space, and it seems like there's lots of low-hanging fruit, Joanne. So what would you recommend to really kick the circularity off and in the future? Joanne? We lost Joanne?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Sorry, you must have been on mute. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Diana, and thanks to Corporate Knights for the opportunity this afternoon to participate. It's really interesting to hear the broad and attention and support for the advancement of the circular economy. It's happening globally, obviously. And in the last, I would say, 2 years, we're really seeing a fervor around this discussions in the Canadian context. We were poised to host the World Circular Economy Forum here in the fall of 2020. Unfortunately, that's going to be pushed into 2021 given the pandemic, but certainly that's an indicator that we see the advantages, the benefits in the triple bottom line areas around the circular economy and how important it is for us to stop living in this linear as take, make, and dispose kind of economy that we've been used to. And it's interesting that, Ralph's comments about the waste industry being the fastest growing of all of the industries in Canada 3 times is, I think, the statistic that he offered us. And that's probably due to the fact that disposal in Canada is relatively inexpensive. In fact, some of the cheapest disposal in the world happens here because we are such a vast nation with so much empty space. And unfortunately, that causes us to have a discrepancy between the cost of disposal over the cost of recycling. So we're starting the situation with economic disparity from the get-go. And over the last number of years, we've really been reliant upon offshore recycling solutions. So we do a lot of collection, we do a lot of staging, we have a lot of material recycling facilities here that sort materials to almost perfection, and then we go ahead and sell them to offshore buyers where there are most of the manufacturing around the globe is happening. And unfortunately, what that has done has basically depleted any of our true recycling processors here. We don't support them in the way that we should. And really, the resource recovery industries need sustainable and quality supplies and demand conditions for them to thrive. Really, those are the bedrock conditions for a thriving domestic recycling industry, and we just haven't have the support that we've needed. So in order for us to really improve the economics of recycling, we're really talking about 3 distinct measures. And the first that we want to put forward is this opportunity that's been talked about already in this webinar, which is procurement, not just as it relates to government procurement, of course, $200 billion annually in all governments, not just feds, but 80% of that coming in from the municipal level means that we have incredible buying power at government levels to connect the broader public policy objectives, environment, social, and economic, and we can be driving that through procurement decisions. And we haven't obviously been doing that with low carbon economies or transitioning to a circular economy. So there is a direct and untapped opportunity that's been recognized. And I have to echo the support of others in that. And I guess not just drafting the policies, but actually seeing it through with proper scoring and evaluations and follow through. And in fact, verification that the kinds of businesses that we are defining green and trying to pull green results or products from, we're actually verifying that. And very little of that is actually happening in a Canadian context. And I think governments are poised to lead the way and lead by example, quite frankly. And then on the policy front, really requiring our supply chains, our manufacturers, our packagers of goods and services right here in Canada to require circular innovation solutions through supply chain requirements. And so really trickling those requirements right through supply chains as well. So we'd like to see a bolstering of recycled content. We'd like to see that mandated, starting with government and then through to the private sector as well. And that's really going to stimulate the domestic recycling processing community right here in Canada. And then I would say, Toby mentioned it in the opening, but to supplement and support that, we'd want to see bans from disposal. We've got this inequity in the cost of disposal over recycling in Canada, so it is cheaper to dispose at the moment. So we need supplemental policies like harmonized DPR across the country and bans of materials that we have capacity to recycle here in Canada, so that we are, again, looping right back to providing our recycling industries with that sustainable and quality supply of materials that we require. And quite frankly, if they've got that with strong demand through procurement, we are setting them up for success.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And I think one of the points that you alluded to there is that procurement, government is a huge procurer, but also Chris has noted in the chat column here that there's lots of other big companies and some of the name brand companies like Apple and Tesla who could be important purchasers of these low carbon products that we're producing in Canada. So working with them is important. And one of those, Apple is buying already in an aluminum project in Quebec. So at this point, I'm going to turn to Quebec and bring in Denis Leclerc, who's the CEO of Écotech Quebec, and ask him how this, what Quebec is thinking about all these possibilities and opportunities.
Thank you. Bonjour. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. What Quebec is thinking, I would say what clean tech ecosystem is thinking about all this. We just talked about issues and challenges, and I would like to focus on opportunities and solutions. You know that Canadian clean tech is probably the best kept secret in Canada. So we need to find ways to increase the adoption of those green innovation throughout Canada. And innovation means not only to reduce our footprint, but also to give those Canadian manufacturing a competitive edge, so to improve their competitiveness. We're part of Canada Clean Tech Alliance, and over the last 2 years, we're doing what we call the Connect. So Canada Connect with international buyers looking for solutions, and they're looking for solutions from Canada, and they're pleased to see the scope of solutions that we have to help them reducing their footprint. Well, I think that we should do the same thing, but domestically. We need to find a way to increase those matchmaking between Canadian manufacturing and our clean technology ecosystem and SMEs and innovators. We need to be creative. We need to find, I don't want to say crazy ideas, but original ideas. Here's a suggestion. Why don't we, first of all, you know that we have great trade commissioners all around the globe. And those great commissioners are promoting Canada. So, and they help us doing these matchmaking with the international buyers. Why don't we have trade commissioners in each province? And their task will be to help facilitating those matchmaking between Canadian manufacturer and our clean tech companies in Canada. Can you imagine that we can help manufacturing to reduce their footprint and at the same time creating jobs and opportunity for our innovative companies? I think that we need to find those ways not only to stimulate private funding by leveraging public money. Of course, money is important, but I think it's our way of thinking and team working that is important for the recovery. We're talking about climate change. Okay, but we have a great opportunity to change the climate and to change the climate positively. Yes, and I can see it's going that way. We can change the climate, the business climate. We can change the financial climate, industrial climate, government climate, to make sure that we have and we will be able to build a strong, innovative, and sustainable recovery. but we need to be creative. And one way of being creative is to find ways to increase the adoption of those, the clean tech that needs to be, because it's going to be very difficult to export our clean technology over the next 2 years. So we have a great opportunity to increase the adoption of clean tech within Canada. Thank you.
Fantastic, Denis. Yeah, I think you know, it's great to talk about opportunities, and Canada certainly does have lots of opportunities, and we've heard today that it's ahead in a number of these important areas. And yes, there may not be so much exporting going on for the next couple of years, but let's be ready when that does open up again, and make best use of that. I'd like to bring in Dave Sawyer now. Dave is the chief economist at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. Dave, you think about these issues daily. How do the things that we've been talking about today fit into your vision and the Commission's vision of the future for Canada?
Yeah, thanks, Diana. Just wrap it up really quick. So I think one of the things lots of folks are thinking about is conditionality around, you know, putting conditions on some of the recovery spending. And when we think about long-term transitions in climate policy, we think about flexible opportunities that don't necessarily require governments to pick winners. So flexible policy instruments like flexible regulations that allow industry to choose sort of their path on compliance forward, carbon pricing, broad-based signal that innovation pays, and, you know, doesn't really sort of pick, it puts, you know, diffuse decision-making into the system. So when we think about COVID recovery, we should be really careful about picking winners, because as the panelists today have said, there are technology winners that aren't so certain. There's all kinds of forks in the road about which technologies are going to emerge and where they're going to apply within the country, within sectors, et cetera. And in the COVID lens, by extension, we have very different impacts on not GHG intensive sectors, on the manufacturing facilities. And they may not necessarily you know, need certain types of GHG reductions, and they may want to basically chart their own path forward. So when you think about conditionality, like under the large employer emergency financing facility, you can think about these plans that are going to be developed, net zero plans that might happen. But then you can think about a broad-based sort of incentive structure to perhaps forgive loans behind those loans that are tailor-made and picked by the facilities to do what they think they need to do. So we're not saying, okay, you know, you should use this product or you should do this. It's more of a broad-based approach to not crowd out these ideas and these decisions. So we have to think really carefully around conditionality and basically think of it in broad-based terms and not crowd out sort of the broad spectrum of opportunities that exist. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We had a last poll, but it's on electrification, and we haven't really talked about the electrification of industry, which was the third leg of this proposal. It is important, and it does provide an underlying, I guess, the facilitation of making a green economy if we are using all that lovely renewable power that we're going to increase if you listen to one of our previous webinars. I think today we've heard a lot about opportunities again. We've heard a lot about procurement. We've heard about regulations regulations and incentives, and those incentives obviously around prices on carbon or paying additional premium for low carbon products. But I think really what's been at the heart of our discussion is acceleration of things that we know have to happen, that we've already sown the seeds for these things. But whether it's recycling or the greening of heavy industry or the electrification of industry more broadly, how can we really accelerate these things so that we are well positioned and really can meet those net zero targets by 2050, but also competitively positioned vis-a-vis the rest of the world as we shake off the COVID malaise, which we hope is coming, you know, before too long. I just want to make one point, which was one of the questions was about the gendered aspects of this area. I think it's wrong to think of industry as just a male area. I'm sure Kent could give us some statistics on the participation of women in heavy industry. But from what I understand, it is increasing, and I do think that this is not just jobs for the boys. Perhaps, Kent, you could just give us 1 second on that before we close. I'd like to thank you all for being here again today, and hope that you'll join us next week and in the coming weeks. And thanks to all our panelists for a great conversation. But Kent, last word to you today. Oh, sorry, Kent, I meant Mark. Sorry, apologies, my error, Mark from the United Steelworkers. But Kent could also comment. Mark, are you there? Can you comment on the gender aspects of this?
Whoops, hang on just a sec. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt, as was pointed out in one of the questions, as you point out, that manufacturing has traditionally been a male-dominated workplace. I mean, one of the things we've seen in Canada, of course, is that as jobs in manufacturing has declined, they've largely been replaced by jobs in the service sector. And I think we need to think long and hard about whether or not we can have an economy going forward that is going to be overwhelmingly reliant on service sector jobs, or whether we need to both promote manufacturing and promote more diverse hiring practices in the manufacturing sector. Because I think one of the things you're seeing, of course, as a result of the pandemic, as many people have pointed out, is at least the initial wave of job losses have been unfortunately focused on women. The word she session, for example, I noted has now hit the New York Times. So yeah, there are clearly gendered issues around this, as there are in all workplaces, and you know, there's a whole that raises a whole number of issues, but no doubt we're hopefully going to see more and more women entering manufacturing work in the coming decades.
Thanks for that. Thanks. I do think it's an important point to raise. Sorry, we've gone over by a couple of minutes, but great to have everyone here today. Thank you so much. Goodbye.